So, relatively short amount of time today. There's a one-page handout that looks like this that we've put out. Hopefully we got everybody. If you're missing one, we've got some extras on one of the chairs, I think, in the back. Did everybody get a handout? Okay, just a couple of topics. The first one I want to spend the most time on, but I definitely want to allow a few minutes to talk about our online tool rollout. I've got folks here with me who can help answer questions if we have questions on either of those topics. So at the May conference, we talked about 4D incentive money, and we talked about our goal on the 4D side is to make sure that at the county level, the incentive funds are used to improve the 4D program. And what that means is, you know, by state statute, it goes into 3 different funds. So sometimes programs, projects to improve the 4D program might mean that those funds need to be shared between elected officials. And at the May conference, I think I got a question about, so how do we effectuate that? And my answer was, well, just transfer money between, in an example, if the clerk is saying to the elected prosecutor, you've got a project that you want to do that's going to improve 4D and you don't have enough incentive money, and I'm willing to give you a certain portion of mine, my answer was, we'll just transfer the money. And there were some gasps out of the audience because, and Debbie was in the back kind of looking at me, so found out later that that kind of went against guidance from State Board of Accounts that you had gotten about transferring funds. So we took a step back and our folks got together. We polled some of the auditors. Thank you for responding to our questions. We met with Debbie to talk from State Board of Accounts perspective on what made sense and what didn't. And the bottom line answer is that we landed back on transfer of money. The thing about this is, though, that State Board of Accounts, we talked with them and we talked amongst ourselves, and one of the important things is documenting, either way, documenting the agreement between the elected officials that says, in my example, clerk, I'm fine with you, elected prosecutor, using some of my incentive money. So there's 2 aspects today. One is to talk through the concept of transfer, and the second one is to talk about the documentation between the elected officials on the agreement. So if you look at the bullet points on the handout, if you go to the 4th one, so really the 2 options were an actual transfer between the incentives funds, or I think we called it a usage agreement, which would mean, for example, that there would just be a document where the clerk said, yeah, prosecutor, you can spend money out of my incentive fund. And as we talked that through with the auditors that we polled, and we talked through that internally, that raised some oh my gods, because who's going to police if you have just a usage agreement and the prosecutor ends up spending more out of the clerk's fund than the agreement was? Not that they do it intentionally, but just the monitoring on that, because that would bring in you, the auditors, and it would bring in us from a monitoring perspective. So that one point alone weighed pretty heavily with a lot of us on this concept of just a usage agreement really was going to cause potentially more issues than a document that said, in my example, clerk agrees that, let's say, $10,000 will be transferred from the clerk's incentive fund to the prosecutor's incentive fund. So in that instance, it's very clear who has control over the money. That means the prosecutor has control over that money. If there is an issue with the expenditure, if State Board of Accounts does an audit and there's an audit finding, if we're doing monitoring and we have a question, it's very clear if there's a transfer from one fund to the other that you go to the person to whom the money was transferred, they've got control over it, that's where the questions arise, that's who you go to. Versus the other elected official who agreed, who, if it's just a usage agreement, who had control over that money? Who is State Board of Accounts going to do an audit finding on? Who's DCS going to go to when you're looking at control over the money? So those two factors really weighed pretty heavily in the decision that our recommendation is that it actually still be a clean, so to speak, transfer of money between accounts. So that leads to, where? Yes. No. Any of the 6 incentive funds. So that leads to the concept of, okay, how are we going to document this agreement? Either way, whether it's a transfer or usage, how are we going to document it? If you look, okay. Oh, thank you, dear. If you look at the back of this, we tried to come up with a very simple form that clerk, prosecutor would fill out and that you as auditors would get a copy of and you would sign to show that you'd received it, because your responsibility would be to transfer the money between the funds. So you need some kind of document telling you to do that. So you'll see it says draft in big bold letters. You're actually the first group to whom we've given this document, and we're looking for feedback on does it make sense to you. Once we get your feedback, we'll go to the clerks and prosecutors and get feedback from them. Do the words make sense? Does this make sense? Is there anything missing? So I just wanted to walk through this pretty quickly. This probably will end up being a state form. We tried to keep it to one page, so it'd be very simple. We use the term transferor and transferee because we couldn't come up with anything better. If somebody can come up with better terminology, we are open to it. So in my example, the clerk would be the transferor and the prosecutor would be the transferee. So they would fill out, I'm going to say Marion County. Marion County clerk, Marion County prosecutor, the fund number. So that would be the chart of accounts fund number for the clerks, either their ARA fund or their regular fund, whatever they've decided that they are going to give to the prosecutor to use. So that fund number would go in here. And then on the other side, where's it going? Now there are rules about the ARA funds, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So then the transfer information. You'll notice that on the left side it says one-time transfer, and on the right side it says periodic transfer. Because one of the questions was, well, we DCS, we give prospective quarterly incentive funds out. So what if it's a scenario where, for example, the prosecutor wants to have a temp staff, potentially. And so the clerks agreed that for a year, they're going to let the prosecutor use so much per quarter. You don't want to have to fill out a form 4 times during that year. So we set this form up so that if it's just a one-time transfer, it's a special project, you just fill out the left side, how much is going to be transferred between the accounts. But if it's a situation where it's a periodic transfer, hopefully we've thought of the scenarios there on the right. So transferor and transferee agree that, I don't know, $1,000 shall be transferred either monthly, quarterly, or yearly. So that's the right side. The next line, so the date that it's to commence, or I'm looking at Donna, transfer date. So that's the date they agreed, right? And then the commencement date of the transfer, and then the termination date, because it might not be forever and ever, probably isn't going to be forever and ever, because in my scenario, the elected clerk is probably not going to want to commit the next elected clerk potentially to a periodic transfer. Purpose of the transfer. It's important from our perspective that we understand what the project is, what's going on that allows the transfer of money between the incentive funds. So that's basically the information about the transfer itself. Yes, ma'am?
Does this apply to the county portion also? And if so, do we need to include the judge, say, or someone else in on it for approval?
So the question is, I'm going to call it the third fund. So the question is, does this apply to the third fund? It could potentially, yes. So if the example is there is a county that has a 4D court. It has to be a 4D court because they have to have a cooperative agreement to do this. So let's say the clerk has agreed that some of their incentive money will be used for the 4D court. So it could be that the transferor is the clerk, the transferee is the 4D court. So in that case, the judge, whoever's over the 4D court, would be signing this. So if you look at the conditions, the very first one, everybody's agreeing that this money is only going to be spent on Title 4D, purposes allowable under law. The next two bullet points basically are saying that both parties are going to maintain the documentation that's necessary that shows what the money is being used for. Then the fourth bullet point is the one about the ARA. So ARA funds can't be mixed with the regular incentive funds. So if it's going from, it can't go from an ARA account to a regular account. It needs to go, the money needs to go from one ARA account to another ARA account. Does that make sense in terms of the ARA question? The next one I want to point out is the second from the bottom. So this just says that both parties, all parties, have current cooperative agreements with DCS, because they're the only ones who can receive the money. And then this last bullet point is the one for you guys. So whoever's the transferee, whoever's the beneficiary of this money, it's their responsibility to get the signatures. It's their responsibility to give it to you as the county auditor, and we're saying within 5 business days of signature. If you guys think that's not enough time, let us know. So it's their responsibility to do that, to get all the signatures, and then it's their responsibility to get you a copy and then to send us a copy with all of the signatures. So you'll notice that the transferee is signed saying they agree to all the terms. At the very bottom, you as the county auditor sign. When did you receive it? And then when did you complete the transfer? So we're definitely looking for feedback on this. If it doesn't make sense, please let us know. Questions? Yes, ma'am. Yes. The question is, does this have to go in front of the county council since it's fund to fund? And the answer, and I'm looking at Debbie, is no.
Is no. It's unappropriated, and it's going from one unappropriated fund to the other unappropriated fund. So.
Yes, ma'am.
How do we show this on our quarterly report that we, or do we? I mean, if they decide to.
The question is, how is this shown on the quarterly report? Do we show it on the quarterly report? So you guys are responsible for showing it on the QIB. I had that question a few minutes ago. So you're responsible on the quarterly incentive balance fund. You would show it as a transfer. Yes. Question over here. I think the question is, does this bypass council And yes, it does, because it's going between two unappropriated funds. Yes, ma'am.
You have a completion date on here. If it's a monthly transfer, what do you want for the completion date? When the last one is done or when the first one is done?
That's an excellent question. Let's think about that for a minute. So, we didn't think about all the scenarios when we were doing this, did we? Well, what makes sense?
It depends on if you want that completely filled out before they send it, that 10-day requirement.
I don't think we need you guys to document every transfer. That I'm staring at my folks. So I should probably introduce folks. Donna Frank, who's a new face to you guys, is a new staff attorney for us, and she's really been helping us working on this. And then you all know Jeff Miller and Chris Nill, Peggy Boggs, who's my assistant deputy director, and then Eric Durnell, whom many of you know for the online tool that we've been working with. Let us ponder that, but I don't think it makes sense for you guys to have to document every single time, as long as you're doing it on the quarterly incentive balance form, because that's where you'll be showing us that every month the transfer's occurring, or that if it's quarterly, 3 times, just depending. So what we're going to do on this is, this would be like an Excel sheet, and then there would be an instruction sheet. So we would put the instructions on the completion date. So that's an excellent question. That's exactly the feedback that we're looking for, because we tried to think through all the scenarios, and obviously we didn't. Yes, ma'am. No. No, that says that the two parties, the transferor and transferee, are okaying it. You're just signing that you've gotten the document and that you're making the transfer. I'm looking at Debbie.
No, but maybe that needs to be more clearly stated, the purpose of what their signature actually means.
So separate those more clearly.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
And then that way there won't be any confusion of who is taking what responsibility.
Okay, so instead of the undersigned, maybe it needs to say, we, the transferor and transferee, agree. So it's clear that those are the two that are agreeing. Other questions or comments just off the top of your head looking at this?
I have one.
Yes, sorry.
Personally, I don't like the periodic transfer.
I'm sorry, say it again?
The periodic transfer, because that puts the responsibility on us to remember to do it. I would think that each time they want to transfer, that they should fill it out and bring it to my office, which says, okay, I'm ready to do this.
Time to do it.
And then we don't have to remember it.
Let me take that under advisement. And the reason I'm hesitating on that is because you all know that there's a lot of incentive money sitting out there in accounts that hasn't been spent. And the folks who have cooperative agreements with us really need to be looking for ways to spend their incentive funds to improve the 4D program. Indiana's doing pretty well. We're improving in terms of how we're doing on supporting families compared to other states, but we're definitely not there yet. And I totally understand the workload on you guys, but I also hate to put impediments in front of folks to transfer money. So I take your point. Let us talk about that. Other questions? I want to give you, I don't have an effective date yet. Looking for feedback from you guys, looking for feedback from the clerks and prosecutors, and then if it's a state form, it has to go through ICPR to make it a state form, so we don't have an effective date yet. I'm going to give you contact, email, and phone number. If you come up with other comments, concerns, questions, I'd like you to send those to Peggy for me, or call her, leave her a voicemail. Her phone number, it's Peggy Boggs, so it's Peggyboggs. Her phone number is 317-232-3450. And then her email address is Peggy, P-E-G-G-Y, dot Boggs, B-O-G-G-S, at dcs.in.gov. So as you think about this, if you've got concerns, comments, questions, if you could let Peggy know, we'll compile all those along with anything we might get from the other elected officials, and then finalize the form, put it through the state forms process, and then figure out how we're going to roll it out and how that communication is going to occur. So I'm going to move on, because I know that you guys are a little bit behind schedule. The online forms tool rollout and training, Eric Durnell is here, and you've met him before if you have questions for him, but I wanted to make sure that we had the upcoming training dates on the handout. So November 5th, there's one in Lake County, December 3rd in Howard, December 18th in Fayette, and it's for whatever counties are in that particular area. And right now we've got 2 training classes per day, so one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and I didn't have room to put all the detailed information on here, but if you haven't signed up for training and you need more detailed information, Eric's contact information is at the very bottom of this handout. Does anybody have, we've already had a couple of questions at the break about the tool and rollout. Is there anything right now that we can answer for anybody?
Cynthia, I've got a question over here.
Oh, thank you.
This isn't to do with the transfers, just with the incentive money. I know it's unappropriated, but can the prosecutor and the clerk give bonuses out of that money to their workers?
Bonuses are allowed, has to fall within the 4D rules.
Well, how do you, with, you know, to back up the support system of the 4D,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last comment.
can they give them to each employee in the office?
It needs to be staff who work on 4D. Any other? So the very bottom of the handout, we just always try to make sure that we give you email addresses and phone numbers for contact information. So Jeff and Chris's email, phone number are on here. And then our DCS accounting operations, Rob Conrad, who's the one who sends the remittance information to you. Eric's email is on here. And then the last thing I wanted to say was at the May conference, we had quite an extensive handout that had information about our child support resources intranet site, and you have to ask for access to it. I know you guys don't get on it that often. So in that handout, we had a lot of information on where you go to see the incentive balances, for example, or the claims guide. And I failed to email that to Debbie and Tammy after the May conference, so it's not out on the auditor's site. But I remembered just before this conference, so they're going to put that handout that had all of that information on it out. It'll be on the auditor's conference site under the May 2013, if any of you need all of that information on the child support resources and what's on there and how you sign up to get access to it.